There is an island in the Arabian Sea, approximately 240 kilometers east of the Horn of Africa and 380 kilometers south of the Arabian Peninsula, where the trees look like they were designed by something that had never seen a tree before. They grow with enormous swollen trunks that store water like living barrels, topped by dense, flat canopies of branches so compact and circular that from a distance they appear to be umbrellas, green, absurd, completely unlike any tree that grows in the continental world around them. Their bark is smooth and pale, their fruit is toxic, they belong to a genus that exists nowhere else on Earth in any form. The island is called Socotra, and the trees are the dragon blood tree, Dracaena cinnabari, and they are among the most extraordinary living organisms on the surface of this planet. Not because of any single remarkable property, but because of what their existence reveals about what happens to life when it is isolated for a very long time in conditions extreme enough to demand radical adaptation. Socotra is sometimes called the Galápagos of the Indian Ocean, and the comparison is apt in the specific scientific sense that the Galápagos comparison is always apt when applied to islands of extreme biological isolation. Both are places where the separation from the continental gene pool was long enough and complete enough that evolution proceeded along trajectories that were impossible anywhere else, producing organisms that look wrong against the background of the familiar biological world, organisms that exist as living evidence of the divergence that isolation permits and that connectivity prevents. But Socotra is older than the Galápagos, more isolated, and has been producing its impossible biology for a period of time that makes the Galápagos comparison feel modest rather than ambitious. The island has been separate from the Arabian Peninsula and the African continent since approximately 20 to 30 million years ago, and in that time it has been doing something that very few land masses on Earth have been able to do without interruption: developing a completely independent biological community from scratch. The physical geography of Socotra is the explanation for its biology, and the geography is itself extraordinary. The island covers approximately 3,600 square kilometers, making it roughly the size of Delaware, and it is composed of three main geological environments. The coastal plain is narrow and hot, exposed to the full heat of the Arabian Sea and the Indian Ocean winds, reaching temperatures that exceed 40 degrees Celsius in summer, and supporting the salt-tolerant mangroves and tidal zone species that form the island's biological margin. The interior plateau and mountain ranges, the Highgare Mountains in the northeast, reach approximately 1,500 meters, are cooler, foggier, and receive more moisture from the monsoon clouds that roll in from the southwest and northeast, catching on the higher terrain and releasing a slow drizzle that the vegetation has evolved to collect and store over millions of years of monsoon-dependent survival. Between the coastal lowlands and the mountain fob zone, the limestone plateau is the primary habitat of the dragonblood trees, a zone where the combination of thin rocky soil, intense sun, and seasonal fog creates exactly the conditions that Socotra's endemic flora has spent millions of years adapting to exploit. The monsoon seasons that govern Socotra's weather are not gentle. From June through September, the southwest monsoon generates winds of such ferocity on Socotra that the island becomes essentially unreachable by sea. The waves and wind make landing impossible for most vessels, and for most of the island's human history, this annual isolation reinforced the biological isolation by limiting the human traffic that might otherwise have introduced continental species. The island's isolation in the monsoon months is one of the reasons that its endemic species found nowhere else on Earth, survived and diversified rather than being displaced by continental competitors brought by human trade and travel. The isolation was not simply geographic, it was seasonal, enforced every year by the same wind system that brought the rain that made the endemic flora possible. The dragonblood tree is the most visually iconic of Socotra's approximately 900 plant species, of which approximately 37%, more than 330 species, are endemic to the island and found nowhere else on Earth. This level of endemism is extraordinary by any comparative measure. For context, Madagascar, which is celebrated globally for its biological uniqueness, has an endemism rate of approximately 90% for its plant species, but is an island of over 587,000 square kilometers, roughly 160 times the size of Socotra, and its diversity reflects simply the accumulation of species over a large area. Socotra's endemism is concentrated into a much smaller space, reflecting a density of evolutionary divergence per unit area that has few parallels among inhabited islands. The tree's common name derives from the deep red resin that seeps from its bark when it is cut, a resin that has been harvested and traded across the ancient world for thousands of years as a dye, a medicine, a varnish for violins and a colorant for plaster, and whose current legitimate uses include traditional medicine and cosmetics. But the resin is secondary to the tree's structural biology, which represents one of the most dramatic adaptations to arid conditions in the plant kingdom. The dragonblood tree's mushroom-shaped canopy, that impossibly dense flat top, is not an accident of growth, but a functional architectural solution to the problem of surviving in an environment where water arrives briefly and unpredictably. The dense flat canopy intercepts the moisture in the fog and mist that rolls across the Socotra Plateau during the dry months and channels the collected water droplets down the tree's smooth bark toward its roots. A passive fog collection system of extraordinary elegance that allows the tree to harvest atmospheric moisture in months when there is no rain. The tree is also adapted to the intense wind of the Socotra monsoon. Its dense canopy distributes wind load across many small branches rather than concentrating it on a few large ones, and its broad, shallow root system anchors it against gusts that would uproot most continental trees. The dragonblood tree grows slowly, taking perhaps 50 years to reach maturity, and individuals are believed to live for several hundred years in some cases, meaning that some of the trees visible on the Socotra Plateau today were established long before European explorers first visited the island. The desert rose, Adenium obesum socotranum, is the second most visually extraordinary of Socotra's endemic plants, a succulent tree whose massively swollen trunk stores water through the dry months in a grotesque barrel of photosynthetic tissue that bears no resemblance to any continental tree, topped by branches that produce brilliantly pink trumpet-shaped flowers in season. The desert rose belongs to the oleander family, and its sap is toxic. It was historically used on Socotra to tip arrows for hunting, but the flowers are among the most vividly beautiful produced by any desert plant on Earth, and the contrast between the pale swollen trunk and the vivid pink blooms against the gray rock of the Socotra Plateau is one of the most striking visual combinations in the natural world. The desert rose of Socotra is a subspecies distinct from the continental forms of Adenium found in East Africa and Arabia. It is larger, its trunk more massively swollen, its flowers more vivid, and its habit more tree-like than any of its continental relatives, reflecting millions of years of selection in Socotra's specific conditions of intense heat, rocky substrate, and episodic rainfall. The cucumber tree, Dendrosicyco socotranum, is the only tree-sized member of the cucumber family on Earth. A plant that reached Socotra's isolation and, freed from the competitive constraints that keep cucumbers as ground-level vines on the continent, evolved upward into a tree, growing a swollen succulent trunk reaching several meters in height and producing foliage and fruit recognizably related to the common cucumber while doing so, from a body plan that resembles nothing a continental biologist would identify as a cucumber relative. It exists only on Socotra. The island produces 7 species of Boswellia, frankincense trees, several of which are endemic to the island alone, and whose fragrant resin has been collected and traded across the Arabian Peninsula and the Horn of Africa for thousands of years. The frankincense trade routes that connected Socotra to the ancient economies of Arabia, India, and East Africa were among the most important commercial routes of the ancient world, and Socotra's role in that trade was well documented by Greek, Roman, and Arab writers who left records of the island's legendary biological distinctiveness. Socotra appears in Ptolemy's geography, in the writings of Marco Polo, and in ancient Arab trading manuals as a source of products found nowhere else, an island apart from the normal world. The biological isolation of Socotra extends to its animal life, though the island's fauna is less celebrated than its flora, partly because the visual drama of the dragon blood trees and the desert rose captures the imagination more immediately than smaller organisms whose uniqueness requires explanation. The island hosts approximately 90 species of birds, of which several are endemic: the Socotra sunbird, the Socotra warbler, the Socotra starling, and the Socotra sparrow are all species found only on this island and whose plumage and song are sufficiently distinct from their nearest continental relatives that the evolutionary separation of their lineages is unmistakable. The Socotra sunbird, whose metallic plumage and curved bill make it one of the most visually striking of the island's endemic birds, feeds primarily on the nectar of Socotra's endemic plants, a co-evolutionary relationship in which the bird and the plant have adapted to each other over millions of years of shared isolation. The plant's flowers shaped to the bird's bill, and the bird's behavior shaped to the plant's flowering season. The island hosts unique species of reptile, including the Socotra chameleon, a species found nowhere else, and whose color change responses are calibrated to the specific rocky and vegetation backgrounds of the Socotra landscape, and several endemic gecko species that have adapted to the island's specific rock surfaces and humidity zones. Some of the Socotra geckos are nocturnal hunters of extraordinary efficiency in the rocky terrain of the limestone plateau. Their toe pads evolved for the specific texture and angle of Socotra rock in ways that make them measurably different from the climbing capabilities of their continental gecko relatives. The island's waters support a rich marine environment. The coral reefs and offshore waters of Socotra are considered among the most productive in the Arabian Sea, supporting populations of whale sharks, sea turtles, dolphins, and a diversity of reef fish that makes the island's marine environment almost as biologically significant as its terrestrial one. The island has no endemic mammals of any size. The large mammals one might expect on a landmass of this size are absent because no large land mammals successfully colonized Socotra during the period of its isolation, and the mammals present are primarily bats and small rodents. This absence of large mammalian predators and competitors shaped the evolution of Socotra's reptile and bird communities in ways analogous to island ecosystems everywhere. In the absence of pressure from mammalian predators, some species lost or reduced defensive behaviors that continental animals must maintain. The human population of Socotra is estimated at approximately 70,000 people, primarily of South Arabian and East African descent, speaking a language, Socotri, that is unwritten and belongs to the modern South Arabian branch of the Semitic language family, sharing its linguistic group with a handful of other minority languages spoken in the southern Arabian Peninsula, and preserving grammatical structures and vocabulary that Arabic and the other major Semitic languages have not retained. The Socotri language has no traditional written form. It has been an oral language for its entire history. Its vocabulary and grammar transmitted from generation to generation through a tradition of oral poetry and storytelling, whose complexity and richness reflect the sophistication of a culture that developed in isolation from the writing systems of the surrounding world. The Socotri oral literary tradition includes poetry forms that preserve knowledge of the island's biology, the names and properties of plants, the behaviors of animals, the signs in the landscape that indicate weather or season, in rhythmic forms designed for memory transmission rather than written record. The survival of this linguistic and cultural tradition has been under increasing pressure from Arabic, which is spoken by younger generations and used in education, commerce, and administration, and whose dominance represents a form of cultural erosion that parallels the biological erosion threatening the island's endemic species. The cultural practices of the Socotri people have been shaped by the same isolation that shaped the island's biology. Traditional knowledge of the island's endemic plants, their medicinal uses, their harvesting, and their role in trade and ceremony has accumulated over generations in oral tradition that is as biologically specific to Socotra as the dragon blood tree itself. The island was under the authority of successive powers including the Mara Sultanate, the Portuguese who briefly occupied it in the 16th century, the British who administered it as part of the Aden Protectorate, and then the People's Democratic Republic of Yemen, and subsequently unified Yemen. The civil war that began in Yemen in 2015 has created serious concerns about Socotra's future, both in terms of the welfare of its human population and in terms of the preservation of its biological heritage. UNESCO designated Socotra as a World Heritage Site in 2008, citing its extraordinary level of endemism and its biological significance as one of the most important islands in the world. From the perspective of global biodiversity, the designation was recognition of something that biological scientists have been communicating for decades: that Socotra's combination of extreme isolation, ancient geological separation, and the specific environmental pressures of its monsoon-driven climate had produced a biological community that has no equivalent anywhere on Earth, and whose preservation constitutes a global scientific and cultural responsibility that extends well beyond the borders of Yemen. The threats to Socotra's ecosystem are significant and in some cases accelerating. The dragonblood trees, which were the dominant vegetation of the island's plateau for thousands of years, are not regenerating adequately. Young trees are not establishing in the numbers required to replace aging individuals. Long-term monitoring of dragonblood tree populations has shown that in many parts of the plateau, the canopy is dominated by mature and old individuals with almost no recruitment of young trees into the understory. A demographic pattern that, if it continues, means the dragonblood tree forest will begin collapsing within decades as the current generation of adults dies without successors. The causes are multiple and interacting. Changes in the goat and livestock grazing pressure that has historically been managed by traditional pastoral practices. Changes in the fall precipitation patterns that the trees depend on for passive moisture collection during the dry season. Changes in the fire regime that historically created the open woodland conditions in which dragonblood seedlings successfully established. The introduction of invasive species, including invasive plant species arriving via the expanded air and sea connections that have developed since the late 20th century, poses a threat to them. Endemic flora that Socotra's seasonal isolation had historically limited. Cyclones, which were historically rare in the Arabian Sea but have increased in frequency in recent decades as the Indian Ocean has warmed, caused significant damage to Socotra's tree populations in 2015 and 2018, with the 2018 cyclone Maikunu estimated to have destroyed a significant fraction of the island's dragonblood tree canopy in the most severely affected areas. The island that the Arabian Sea monsoon protected for millions of years from the biological introductions that have devastated island ecosystems worldwide is now accessible year-round by air, and the biological boundary that monsoon winds enforced is no longer enforced. What 20 to 30 million years of isolation and evolutionary divergence have produced on Socotra is irreplaceable. What can be lost in decades of changed access, introduced species, climate shift, and political instability is everything.